Shabbat Shalom, friends. So nice to be here with all of you. So for the past 3 years, since my mother passed away 4 years ago on January 12th, on Kaf Hey of Tevet, I've been teaching in her memory and in her honor for her Yahrtzeit. When things were more normal, we would have a lunch and learn in her memory. And for the last 2 years, I've been sharing some words of Torah in shul instead. My mother, Yacov Fruchter, daughter of Holocaust survivors, was born in communist Romania in 1955. With her older sister, her parents smuggled the family to Israel when she was 5 years old. And after the death of her own mother, who was only 45, she moved to Montreal with her father at the age of 13. As an immigrant in the Orthodox Jewish community of Montreal, with her thick accent, the daughter of a broken yet kind man who worked as a shamus at the shul and the floor cleaner at Continental Kosher Butcher Shop. Some of you may have enjoyed some of the meat from there. I know I have. Whom she needed to cook and clean for from the time she was a tween, my mother knew hard work. She knew avodah kasha. And she knew what it was like to be a stranger, to be othered. Somehow, this experience instilled in her an unwavering moral compass, which included a commitment to doing her best to avoid taking advantage of anyone else, especially financially. This also demonstrated itself as a cautious stance or maybe discomfort in asking help from others, while being very willing to help others in need. So much so that when she was quite sick towards the end of her life, we had to really encourage her to get support from her friends who stepped up really beautifully to care for her when she needed it the most. And so thinking about my mother's stance when it comes to financial justice, not taking advantage of others, I've been wondering this week what she would say about Exodus 12, 25, and 36. So I actually ask you to open up your Chumash if you have it. I think it's going to help you. On the bottom of page 387. Uvenei Yisrael asu kidvar Moshe, vayishalu mimitzrayim kli chesed v'kli zahav u'smalot, v'Hashem natan et chen ha'am b'nei Mitzrayim vayashilum vayinatzlu et Mitzrayim. The translation we have in our Chumash is that the Israelites had done Moshe's biding and borrowed from the Egyptians, this is right at the bottom of the page, borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver and gold and clothing. And the Lord had disposed the Egyptian favorably towards the people, and they let them have their request. Thus they stripped the Egyptians. And I want to actually just give you a moment before I go on, also just to reflect. How do you feel when you read this pasuk, when you hear these words? The translation here tells us that they followed Moshe's order. And what was Moshe's order? That they should borrow these objects, these expensive objects from the Mitzrim, from the Egyptians. And they borrowed them and they stripped the Egyptians. Vayinatzlu et Mitzrayim. How do you feel when you read these words? What does it make you think of? Is it just? Does it make you feel uncomfortable? Does it make sense to you? Do you feel good about it? And in fact, what they're doing here is the fulfillment of the prophecy, of the vision that Moshe has at the burning bush. Back in the 3rd chapter of the book of Shemot, God tells Moshe that this is what's going to happen. that they are going to leave Egypt in this way. And right before the last of the Makot, the last of the plagues, that Lauren read so beautifully this morning, they once again are reminded that right before you leave, you're going to do this. You are going to borrow. Vayashilum, you are going to borrow from the Egyptians. Borrowing, of course, makes us think that there's some trickery going on. Why pretend that you're going to return it? They weren't going to return it. There was no chance that was going to happen. Why the need to strip them? To strip, there's some degrading language in that. To strip the Egyptians of all their wealth, of everything that they had. Hundreds of rabbis have commented on this text, defending the rights of Bnei Israel to take this wealth with them. But interestingly, the Torah itself gives no reason for it. No justification, because the Torah doesn't believe there needs to be justification for this. It makes sense. This is what they're meant to do. In fact, it's a direct order from God that this is what they have to do when they leave. Nechama Leibowitz, 20th century modern scholar, genius, the Morah, the teacher of Torah to the Jewish people, especially in Israel in the 20th century, explores this and just compiles many, many commentaries on it, which I had the chance to explore this week. And what I want to just think about for a moment with you is, why did hundreds of commentators, hundreds of rabbis feel the need to defend these actions? What is it about this text that makes us want to answer? Well, to give excuses, to give reasons for it. One reason is that anti-Semites, for the last couple of thousand of years, have used this text to demonstrate how awful Jews are. That look how we plunder the people that we live among. Should be careful of those Jews. Look what they're going to do. Just the way they treated the Egyptians, that they stripped them, they're going to do the same to our land. And I think another reason is because there is some discomfort about treating others in this way. Maybe it's because of a slave mentality. Maybe it's because of the ingrained anti-Semitism, or maybe it's also because we want to think that we're able to reach a higher level of morality, that we don't want to treat those who oppressed us in the same way. We don't want to treat them badly the way we were treated. When I was exploring these sources this week and preparing for this Dvar Torah today, there was a piece of news that really called out to me, that I was reflecting on as I was reflecting on the commentaries on this text. And that was the settlement that was announced on Tuesday. That was at least what's called an agreement in principle between First Nations leaders, by Indigenous leadership, with the Canadian federal government on a $40 billion deal, which will compensate young people harmed by Canada's discriminatory child welfare system. What this is referring to is children who are living on reservations and in the Yukon who were taken away out of their homes as a way of trying to care for them. And what was found, and this we've known this now for a while, really since 2006, is that the welfare systems in the reservations get considerably less funding than the rest of Canada. In other words, they're treated differently. And so as a part of reconciliation, part of reparations, is this plan to both give financial support to those who were harmed and also a commitment to change the system for the future. And I want to share with you three commentaries on the text that I just shared, on the Torah, that I found particularly helpful as I think about reconciliation, restitution, and rebuilding families. The first one comes from Rabbeinu Hananel. It says, what does this word Vayish'alu, which the rabbis really struggled with, this idea of borrowing. Some commentators just dismiss it and say, no, they wasn't borrowing. Vaishalu also could mean sha'al, to ask, right? They were just asking, and the Egyptian said, okay, here you go. Some commentaries refer to it as a gift. Rabbeinu Hananel says, why were they so willing? Why were the Egyptians so willing to give this money, to give these valuable gifts? Because it was restitution. Because as it says in Deuteronomy, that even if you have a Jewish slave and they go free after 6 years, you can't send them rekam. You can't send them out back into the world empty-handed. In other words, this is restitution. This is the Torah teaching us that when these slaves go out, they deserve to be paid for those 210 years of manual labor. And the Egyptians understood it, that there was no way to truly compensate them for all they went through. That's Rabbeinu Hananel on restitution. Shai held in Dvar Torah, Rabbi Shai held from Hadar, New York, in 2015, explores also the same questions. He has an article that he calls Receiving Gifts and Learning to Love the Stripping of the Egyptians. And in it, he also explores Nechama Leibowitz's work and cites a 19th and 20th century rabbi from Germany named Beno Jacob, or Beno Yacov. Rabbi Beno Yacov, living in Germany, notices all the anti-Semitism around him, sees everything that's going on. He ends up dying in England in 1945, managed to escape Germany in 1939, so doesn't have to live through the atrocities of the Holocaust. But he takes us in a different direction, also referring to these gifts and thinking about reconciliation. He writes that this moment of the Egyptians giving these gifts to Bnei Israel is the most elevated and spiritual reconciliation among people. It was full of wisdom and love of fellow men. What he says is that the gifts given by the Egyptians were a clear public protest against the policies of the royal tyrant. The people were disagreeing with Paro in that moment. They were practicing reconciliation. They demonstrated a renewal of public conscience. It showed a moral change. The receptive heart of the Egyptian people was now contrasted to the hard heart of Paro. The word chen gets used in all the psukim connected to this commandment, that the chen of God was placed on the Egyptians. In other words, the Egyptians were now disposed favorably. That word chen also gets used in many places in our liturgy, chen v'chesed v'rachamim, or in Kaddish, china v'chista v'rachamim. It also often gets used connected to women. And we see it actually in the words of Eshet, Chayil, Shekera, Chen. And Chen often, when connected to women, refers to like a certain kind of charm. Women who have a certain smile, a warmth to them. I would describe my mother as a woman of Chen, who really exuded that. And what Rabbeinu Yaakov, Beno Yaakov says, is not only did God work God's charm, God's chen on the Egyptian people at that time, but he also worked it on the Jews, on Bnei Israel of the time. What actually God was trying to do was create peace between the two people. He writes, the Israelites stretched out their hands in friendship, and the Egyptians responded with farewell gifts. In the final hours in Egypt, peace between the two peoples was God's main concern. And why was this important? Because God did not want Bnei Israel to leave Egypt with hate in their hearts. God did not want Bnei Israel to be hardened like Paro was. And just like God softened the Egyptians, so too, God softened Bnei Israel, seeking to ensure that the mandate to love rather than hate would be the lesson Israel learned from its time in Egypt, God commanded in no uncertain terms, as we see in Deuteronomy, "You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in this land." You cannot hate Egyptians after everything you experience. It's a commandment in our Torah. God was teaching reconciliation in the final hours in Egypt. Final piece I want to just highlight, which comes from Moshe Greenberg's book, Understanding Exodus, from 2013, a holistic commentary on Exodus. He explores the words, if you want, you can flip with me, in the burning bush, which is on page 332 in your Chumashim, verses 21 and 22. "And I will dispose," again, the same, very similar language, "and I will dispose the Egyptians favorably toward this people, so that when you go, you will not go away empty-handed." And here what's added is that each woman shall borrow from her neighbor, and the lodge in her house objects of silver and gold and clothing. And here's the added part. "And you shall put these on your sons and daughters, thus stripping the Egyptians." And the question that gets asked is, why was it necessary to place this clothing and these vessels and these jewels on the children? So one answer that Moshe Greenberg brings, which is often the answer given, is to stress that the liberation of the parents along with their offspring. God forbid we should think that the kids remain behind. It was very clear here, no, the kids are going along with the parents towards liberation. But Moshe Greenberg brings something else which I think is so important for our time. He writes that the recovery of dignity by the liberated slaves would be signalized by their being able to provide good things for their children. Of even greater importance in their own enrichment was their capacity to assert parental solitude towards their children. What God is doing by instructing them to place clothing on their children is giving them the opportunity, which they're sort of stripped of themselves as slaves, to be parents to their children once again. In this act, God was showing them how to be a parent, how to care for your children, how to show love. When I think about the indigenous communities and the brokenness that exists there, and the reparations that the Canadian government is now trying to, although reluctantly, trying to show, is very much about rebuilding families, about rebuilding homes, about giving them the opportunities, the skills, the resources to be good parents, to be loving parents, to be kind parents. My mother lost both of her parents at a young age. As I said before, her mother at a very young age. And through the love of community, being a part of the Jewish community, she was shown by others how to be a good mom. And in fact, she was a wonderful mother, one who was able to live in the world with chen, with grace, with charm, and with kindness. That's what we hope for all parents, and we have to do our part to support those who are struggling with it. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.